So for the purpose of today's discussion, which is a brief, because I got to be done at 11. So I can't promise this will be any good, but it will be short. Brief history of the Anglican Church. I just want to put before you a great resource. I would suggest you buy this book. It is titled Our Anglican Heritage. And it's written by one of our former bishops, John Howe. Yep. John Howe. And a friend of his who was one of my seminary professors in college, Sam Pascoe. He taught at Gordon Conwell when I was a student there. It's a fantastic survey of Anglican history from the Reformation straight to today. It's very easy to read. It's called Our Anglican Heritage by John Howe and Sam Pascoe. So I'll leave this up here on the podium, and after our time this morning, if you'd like to investigate it, take a picture of it or something, you can buy it on Amazon. All right, so here we go. So session 1 of our DNA class, which is the DNA of an Episcopalian or an Anglican. And as we start, I'm going to attempt to tell the brief history of the Episcopal Church, and I got a bunch of notes and I'm going to read them so I don't chase rabbit trails. But this will begin with what I'm titling the decidedly Protestant formation of the Anglican Church and the early years of indecision. So our decidedly Protestant formation and the early years of indecision. So if you know anything about our Anglican tradition, we are one of the 3 Protestant streams that came directly out of the Catholic Church in the 1500s. Directly out of the Catholic Church in the 1500s. You have the Protestant Reformation taking place with Martin Luther, and you have John Calvin, Martin Luther, and Thomas Cranmer all a part of this. Luther, who would be the one who would get credit for the Lutheran tradition. John Calvin, who would get credit for the Reformed tradition, or what would be most like the Presbyterian Church today. And then, of course, the Anglican tradition coming from Thomas Cranmer. All 3 of these guys were alive at the same time, and all 3 of them existed within the system of the Catholic Church that I'm going to discuss and describe now. And many of you know this if you've taken Western civilization. From the 1300s to the early 1500s, the Catholic Church experienced some problems, right? And there was quite a bit of corruption that took place in the medieval and early Reformation Catholic Church. Some of these problems were structural and others were theological. Let me just mention a few. Corruption of the celibacy. So Catholic priests were to be celibate and unmarried. However, at least a fourth of German priests by Martin Luther's day were openly married, and everyone in the town knew it. Okay? So we have an issue in the Catholic Church where, my goodness, our leaders just quite frankly aren't practicing what they're preaching. Simony was a major issue in the Catholic Church, and by simony I mean the sale of the priesthood to the highest bidder. So if you live in a parish system in Western Europe, which all of England, by the way, was entirely Catholic before the Protestant Reformation, and all the churches in England, which would become beautiful Anglican churches, were all Catholic churches. And they were the centerpiece of town, so much that parish life existed around the church, which was in the middle of that little square. And not only the religious life of every town, but the economic and governmental life of the town was often centered around the parish too. Well, if you're a rich guy, you might be tempted to exploit this. And the Catholic Church, for various and sundry reasons, began to, in certain places, sell the priesthood of the parishes to the highest bidder in town for the economic gain that took place in the business function of the church being in the middle of the town, not only the religious function, which means you've seeded the priesthood with people who don't know what they're talking about, right? Simony, the sale of the priesthood for economic gain. Along with simony came something called absenteeism. So if you purchased the priesthood for economic gain, yet you're a wealthy business owner who's got other stuff to do, what would you do? You would put what you would call a vicar in your place to, the root here is vicarious, to vicariously stand in for you, the priest, while you go and do your business duties. So now we have a priest who shouldn't be there, putting a vicar who shouldn't be there in charge of a church where most of the service was in a language people didn't understand. Latin. right? Which opens the door for, at times and in places, some real difficulty. The theological conditions in the Catholic Church had also become tenuous. The Latin Mass had created gaps in people's understanding of core Christian doctrine, and at times the Catholic Church exploited these gaps for its own gain. You know the story, but I'll just mention one little nuance that all of us are familiar with from high school. In 1517, a professor of moral theology at the University of Wittenberg in Germany named Martin Luther posted an essay speaking against one such exploit. The title of the essay was this: 95 Theses or Disputations Against the Power of Indulgences. Indulgences was the practice of purchasing by gift to the church, purchasing time of your relatives out of something called purgatory. All right? So you could pay down somebody's time in purgatory if you give a gift to the greatest and latest cathedral building campaign. Refuting the practice, the Protestant Reformation accidentally began. And think about this term, Protestant Reformation. What is this? It's a protest against some of the abuses that were really taking place in the Catholic Church with an attempt to reform the church. And Martin Luther, I would think, if he were here, would say, I did not intend to start Lutheranism. In fact, he would say later in his memoirs, dear goodness, do not name this movement after me. I'm a beer drinker, right? Don't name a church after me. I wasn't trying to start a church. I wanted to reform the Catholic Church, of which I was a part of, and protest some of the abuses within it. Now, as Luther's doing this, Calvin is doing this as well, and a person named Thomas Cranmer is doing this, which enters our story in the Anglican stream. Now, 9 years prior to the posting of the 95 Theses, in 1508, King Henry VIII was coronated king in England. King Henry was called the Fide Defensor by the Pope because of his loyalty to the Catholic Church until he was unable to marry and asked the Pope for an annulment of his marriage. Unable to have children with his first wife, Catherine. Male children. The Pope would not annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. After 10 plus miscarriages, having not granted his annulment through the act of royal supremacy, King Henry VIII officially broke all ties to the Catholic Church and started a new one, which he was in charge of, titling it aptly the Church of England. And the Anglican Church was born. How's that for a wonderful beginning, right? Hey, tell me how you guys got started. Well, King Henry VIII now has a power vacuum, as the Pope is no longer the official head and authority structure of the church. He appoints Thomas Cranmer, head of the newly formed Church of England, and says, look, would you come up with a book that outlines our new doctrinal position as this new Church of England? And in 1549, the first Book of Common Prayer was written, outlining what it meant to be a part of this new Church of England and what it was to believe theologically. And whether Henry VIII knew it or not, Thomas Cranmer was a hardcore Protestant and made this church very evangelical and very Protestant in its theology, very Christocentric, very focused on the person and work of Jesus as fully sufficient unto eternal life, which was the major pushback against what was going on in the Catholic tradition at the time. Thomas Cranmer, in his evangelicalism, outlawed altars, candles, vestments, stained glass, statues, and icons in all the new Church of England churches. He's like, I don't even want this to look Catholic in any way. In fact, the altar that's in our sanctuary that's against the wall, he had them all pulled off the wall and removed because he felt like they were a Catholic vestige that put the priest in front of the people in such a way that it spoke to the church that they did not have direct access to God apart from the mediation of the priesthood. And Cranmer thought that that was anathema. This is the way the Anglican Church began until the rise of Mary Tudor in 1553, and her 5-year reign where she was aptly named Bloody Mary. Mary was a tremendously devout Catholic, did not like the reforms that Thomas Cranmer had initiated. Over 300 clergy were killed during her reign, over 1,000 exiled. She completely pushed back against the early Protestant evangelical tendencies of the Anglican Church and turned things back to a very Catholic practice. And this continued for 5 years until her death in 1558, when the next queen, Queen Elizabeth I, took the throne. And she realizes she has a problem on her hands between a very Catholic Anglican Church and a very Protestant Anglican Church. So she strikes a balance between Catholic and Protestant with what is called the Religious Settlement Act of 1559, also known as the Elizabethan Settlement, which, and this is very important for who we are, this is who we are as a church. It returns the church to decidedly Protestant theology, yet makes room for Catholic practice. You think, well, how did we get here to what you just were a part of? This is how we got here. We have a church that's decidedly Protestant. We believe in the person and work of Jesus for salvation. We believe that you have direct access to God the Father through the mediating presence of Jesus. We believe you can confess your sins and be forgiven directly, straight to God, without the mediating presence of the priesthood. Yet, my goodness, we kind of look like Catholics, don't we? This is a result of the Elizabethan settlement, which said, look, it's okay to vest. It's okay to have candled processionals. It's okay to do Gregorian chant, so long as those things are a godly aid to worship through sound doctrine in the presence of Jesus. And I would put before you that that's still who we are as a church. You might be asking the question, well, okay, why does our sign on the front door then say Episcopal Church and not Anglican? Well, there's an easy solution and an easy answer to this, and it's this little thing called the Revolutionary War. So the first Episcopal churches in America were all Anglican parishes. So the parish that my wife and I were married in, St. Mark's in Fincastle, Virginia, was established as an Anglican church, which became a very unpopular name after 1776. Hard to get your buddies to come to a church called the Church of England. Right? So in 1785, what was that, about 9 years after the war began, the Protestant Episcopal Church in the USA, known as PECUSA, was chosen. And in 1789, the first General Convention is held. A new prayer book for the American Protestant Episcopal Church was created, and it was almost exactly the same as the British prayer book, except there were no prayers for the king or queen. All right? And all this is in, there's a preface to the Book of Common Prayer you can read, which will tell you this short history, and that's all in there. What's interesting is that most Anglican churches during the early part of their seeding in America were very basic and Protestant, almost Congregationalists in the way they look. You go north in the Anglican Church in America, you go up, New England and so on, you go to Vermont or New Hampshire, you go in an Anglican church, what you're usually going to see is whitewashed walls and clear glass windows. And you think, well, what's this all about? Well, those churches were founded in a time in the Anglican Church when it was really cool to be less Catholic, not more, in terms of practice. Now remember, the Elizabethan settlement sort of allows for both. Yet you come down to the Deep South, where churches were built sort of mid to late 1800s, early 1900s. There's stained glass everywhere, golden crosses everywhere, saints in every corner, side altars, candles. Looks pretty Catholic, doesn't it? Yeah. It's because historically, those churches were founded after what's called the Anglo-Catholic shift, which is our next little journey of Anglican history, and it's just this. In 1883, several professors in England began to say, look, we've got this church that's become really Protestant, iconoclastic in the sense that it's just very bare bones, feels like Puritan to me. We've become too much like our culture. We need to wade back into the transcendent beauty of our past. Let's go drive back into some of the Catholic practices that sort of faded away in the last 100 years of Anglicanism. So what I'm trying to say is the church has sort of shifted back and forth from the way it looks in terms of its style, from very evangelical low church to very high church Anglo-Catholic. And one of these shifts took place in the 1880s called the Anglo-Catholic shift. These leaders said, Let's promote tracts all around town that are going to encourage people to move back to more Catholic practice and style. And it's stuck. This actually is where things like this came back into the church. 1880s. So what I'm saying to you is these kind of things came back into our tradition as recently as 140 years ago. Kneeling at prayer. Hombres are the reservation of the sacrament. You know, after the Eucharist, we take everything, we put it in a little box off to the side. That's called the reservation of the sacrament. We put the extra host in there. That was outlawed by Thomas Cranmer at the beginning of the Anglican Church because he knew that some folks who grew up in a Catholic tradition would go try and get some, put it on their dashboard as a good luck charm, carry a Jesus around all week. Right? In fact, part of the reason why in some Episcopal churches the priest puts the host directly on your tongue, that was a practice that began in the Catholic Church through, in some sense, a superstitious belief of the sacrament, where people would take it, put it in their pocket, and carry it around for protection all week. So the priest is like, I don't think so. I'm going to watch you eat it. Watch you eat it. I'm going to watch you eat it. I'm going to watch you eat it. Kneeling for prayer came back in the 1880s. Hombres and reservation of the sacrament. Altars. So there's been a big fight in our tradition over what we call that thing where we celebrate communion. Is it an altar or is it a table? Right? Well, the very sort of evangelical low churchmen, of which unashamedly I am one, you know this by now, right? Says, no, that's a table. The imagery here is not sacrifice, other than a sacrifice of thanksgiving. The imagery here is the Last Supper, Jesus eating with his friends. Right? There are those Episcopalians who are more Anglo-Catholic who would say, no, this is an altar. Like, we're celebrating the sacrificial sacrifice of Jesus, even in a sense where he actually comes and invades this bread to where it transubstantially changes into his presence. Right? Viewing the Eucharist that way comes back into our tradition in 1883. Stained glass, Gregorian chant, processions, candles, gilded crosses. All of those things come back during the Anglo-Catholic shift. So what must we say in 5 minutes or less? Here's what we say. Let's live into who we are as what I would call a big tent church. And here's what I mean by this. We're a church that is lock solid sure that Jesus has done for you what you can't do for yourself. And if you pay attention to the prayer book liturgy, that's everywhere. I mean, just go grab your bulletin that we just read this morning and go back and read it again. It is so full of the atoning sacrifice of Jesus. That's Protestantism. That's who we are as Anglicans. Yet you and I have worshipped at Episcopal churches all over the country that look vastly different in terms of how that's executed. From a very low church evangelical who doesn't even wear vestments to a very high church Anglo-Catholic who wants to chant everything and wave smoke at you. And it's all good. It's all good. Let's talk for just a moment about what I would call current governance and recent decline. The term Episcopal means a church led by bishops. The Anglican Communion consists of 80 million parishioners from 160 countries, broken into 39 provinces, all led by bishops. The Episcopal Church, Protestant Episcopal Church USA, is a small part of that, with only 1.6 million members, broken up in 109 dioceses in America. 109 dioceses, 1.6 million members. We're only one of 39 provinces globally in the Anglican Church. Now think about this. Most of the growth in the Anglican Church in the past 30 years has been in the global south. So the equator south. Most of it's been in Africa. Listen to this. 18 million Episcopalians in Nigeria. Of course, they're called Anglicans there. Remember, 1.6 in America. 8 million Anglicans in Uganda. 4 million in South Africa. 5 million in Kenya. 3 million in Australia. If you said, what does an Anglican look like across the world? This person would be under 40, very dark skin, and female. That's what an Anglican looks like across the world, which is really different from in our tradition, isn't it? Really different from what you see in North America. In the past 30 years, attendance has declined dramatically in our little portion of the Episcopal Church, of the Anglican Communion. these numbers are generous, and it's worse than this now. 25% decline in average attendance in the Episcopal Church in America over the past 10 years, averaging just around 3% decline a year. Of course, many of you know that the decline was precipitously aggravated in 2003 with the Episcopal Church's ordination of a bishop who was in a same-sex marriage. Regardless of what you think about that, that was something that really did careen the church lower and lower in numbers. And the reason I'm mentioning it is because you need to know this little part of our story. Why is it that we're called Holy Trinity Episcopal Church, but you drive down the street and you might see Prince of Peace Anglican Church? I thought, Tom, you said that Episcopalians in America are Anglicans after the Revolutionary War. Why are there now Anglican churches again? Well, it's this little part of our history that precipitates that. In 2003, there were many, many Episcopal churches in this diocese and others who, as a result of the ordination of Gene Robinson, said, we can't be a part of the Episcopal Church anymore. What do we call ourselves? Let's call ourselves Anglican again. Almost all, I would say nearly all. I can't think of one that's not this way. Nearly all the Anglican churches in this region were former Episcopal churches that broke away after 2003. Boy, we would have been stronger if that had happened. Schism is almost always bad for the church.
They joined, peace is part of the London.
Right. Yeah, so originally what happened is there was something called the Anglican Mission in America, where African bishops would come and ordain these bishops as they began this new Anglican movement. So, lastly, I'll just say this. Of the 109 dioceses that are existent in America, there are several who have said, you know what, we're not ready to condone the thing that ripped apart the Episcopal Church in 2003 in the sense that we're not going to allow for the blessing of same-sex marriage in our diocese. We're not going to be mean about it, but it's just not something we're ready to do. We'd rather maintain what they're calling an Orthodox view of marriage, which is in line with the Anglican communion in general, which doesn't bless this, okay? There are only 3 dioceses in America of this 109 that have taken that position, and you should just know that you're in one. So that may be news to you. You're actually in a diocese that has said officially in canon rule, we're not going to make an issue out of it. We're not going to be, you're never going to hear me preach about it. Good gracious, I'm smarter than that, right? We're going to be a church that's going to welcome all people, absolutely, with no reservations, but I actually can't perform a same-sex marriage. If I did that, I would lose my job immediately. That's the condition under which I work in, and that's an unusual condition for the Episcopal Church, but that's the one that exists here. So, that's where we are. My goodness, we're out of time, so I'm going to give you a homework assignment, and I hope you'll take yourself up on it. Grab your prayer book and troll all the way to the back and find this document called the 39 Articles, which is the official doctrinal statement of the Anglican Church. You're going to see a bunch of stuff that's really mad at the Catholics. This document comes right out of the Protestant Reformation. It's the bedrock theological document that helps us understand how we got started. We're going to talk a little bit about that next week, but our primary task next week is going to look at the Nicene Creed as a fundamental statement of Christian doctrine and belief. Should be a lot of fun. Hope you'll come back. God bless you. Don't be afraid to ask your questions. Got 15 minutes until I have to go celebrate the Eucharist again. Hope that was informative. So please do sign up if you haven't signed the sign-up sheet, and don't forget our Anglican heritage right here, John House, San Pasco, up at the front. God bless.